Hello, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to thank you very much for joining me for this on-demand session as part of this virtual Hero conference. Just wanted to say to start off how much I really enjoy coming to the conferences every year. And I was very excited to be able to have an opportunity to come to Dallas, given the enthusiasm and the energy that those Dallas constituents always bring every year. So I do look forward to a time when we're able to get together again in person. But for now, I'm happy to present virtually. So without any further ado, I'll get started. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about the results of my PhD thesis research, which examined cancer in children's picture book, examining the quality of text, the accuracy of representation of the illness experience, and also children's response to 3 specific texts. So first I wanted to mention why I embarked on this research and what inspired it. So throughout my life, I've really been fascinated and inspired by the world of literature, especially children's picture books. Drawn to picture books for their multimodal functionality, their engagement of children of all ages, and their making subjects accessible, I knew that picture books would be a significant resource when I fulfilled my dream of becoming a teacher. So my first teaching experience was quite unique. I was hired to pilot an education program for children with serious illnesses and their healthy siblings in a healthcare-related institution. So in the beginning, that involved me conducting tutoring sessions out of a closet. Next, I taught out of a converted bedroom, but over the years, I've been able to see that education program grow into a private school that is now in a purpose-built space and has a larger staff. So during the time that I've been working at the school, over 17 years, I've really taught children from kindergarten to grade 12, everything from how to read to how solar energy works to how to create a cohesive fashion collection. And it's been, really exciting. It's been really fun. It's been really rewarding, but it's also been challenging at times as my staff, my students, and I are attempting to co-construct a safe, supportive learning environment where topics such as illness and grief can be discussed openly. So, throughout all these years, I've really relied upon children's picture books whenever possible to cover curriculum expectations, to engage learners, just as I dream. But I've also looked to picture books to provide representations to children of what they've been experiencing. And it's there that I found a gap. Really recognize that, children with disabilities, including those with serious illnesses, were rarely represented in children's picture books. And when they were, those books were reinforcing stereotypes and were of overall low quality. And I found that especially in the beginning of my career. It was also at that time really impossible to find these texts. So I found that as an educator of children with illnesses, obtaining high quality, engaging picture books that accurately reflected their experiences was a daily challenge. So it was really from that, those in-class experiences, direct experiences with families going through challenges that drove me to create this research and to see, were there texts out there that were better? Were there texts there that children would respond to in a really positive and engaging way? So I set out with the following research objectives. The first was to select picture books featuring main characters with cancer to analyze for quality and accuracy. The second was to engage directly with children and obtain their reaction to the top rated text. I noticed that a lot of content analyses that had been conducted, specifically looking at children with disabilities or illnesses, rarely engaged with children and got their responses to the text. So that was something that was very important to me, was to prioritize children's voice in this research. And of course, I also wanted to contribute to the limited knowledge base examining children with disabilities and illnesses in picture books. So in terms of my methodology, it was really 2 parts. There was a content analysis, which was the first part, where I wanted to examine different books, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the criteria of that. And then I also conducted semi-structured interviews with children who were in active treatment. As I mentioned, prioritizing children's voice was really important to me, and I wanted to make sure that that was a key part of the research. So for the content analysis, I had different criteria that I looked at for choosing the books, because obviously I wanted to be able to have a good text set, but I also wanted to make sure that the children could really relate to the books. And so that's why when I was looking at them, I wanted it to be a book that the main character had cancer, and also that the main character was a human character, not an animal character. A lot of the literature has talked about how animal characters are often there as a distancing method, and are used maybe to communicate difficult knowledge to children, as that character feels a bit distant from them. That was not what I wanted in the study. I really wanted the children to be able to respond directly to that main character. So I chose human main characters that had cancer. And I looked at books written between a period of 2006 and 2017, which is at the time when I was doing the research. And also I wanted to look at books that were fictional, and they had to be written and illustrated by an adult, and they also had to be readily available. I wanted it, that was very important to me, because I felt that I wanted to be reviewing books that the families that I was working with would be able to access and be able to look at. So taking a book that was published once was no longer able to be purchased and on online site or accessed through a library, that wasn't going to work for me, because I wanted it to have direct relevance to the population that I was working with. So as a starting point for my analysis, I really looked at some of the existing frameworks that are available to evaluate books featuring children with disabilities and illnesses. So I relied upon 3 and combined elements from these 3 existing frameworks. So those frameworks were the Images of Encounters profile that was first developed by Blaska and amended by Nazatir. Then I looked at the text and visual feature analysis from the Prater, Dykes, and Johnson framework, and then the I Am Not the Disability Bland and Gone framework from 2013. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what was in the, or what were in the frameworks, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for some of the things that I was looking for in the books. So in terms of characterization, one of the criteria was that the character grows and develops throughout the story. Another criteria was that there were realistic descriptions of the person with illness, and also that the characters were engaged in typical and meaningful interactions with other characters. So those were some of the characterization criteria I looked at. In terms of illustrations, I was looking at, were the illustrations age appropriate? Would they appeal to children? And were similar art styles used for characters with and without the disabilities and illness? So was it consistent throughout the story? Those are just a few examples of the things that I was looking for based on these criteria. Was also looking in terms of characterization to see, were there other things that I could see in it? And so some of the pieces that came out were actually from my own analysis. So I had those 3 frameworks as a base, and then I put in some other criteria as I was reading through the books, which is consistent with the grounded theory approach. So I added my own criteria, which was in terms of characterization, were there multicultural characters? Were there non-stereotypical portrayals of gender? I really recognize the value of including criteria from gender schema and critical race theory, which is more important in these modern content analysis, or not more important, but it's considered more now when we're looking at children's picture books. So I also added in some other criteria to do with plot, which was there an inclusion of factual information explaining cancer and or cancer treatments? So those were a few examples of the criteria that I added as well. I also examined the demographic information of the main characters and of the text illustrators and the authors. So I wanted to look at, who wrote the book, and did that have any impact on the quality of the book or the content in the book. So another piece that I saw as I was going through the books was that rhyme and repetitive phrases were used a lot. So as I was looking at the criteria, I'd say, was this an effective use of rhyme or a repetitive phrase? So those were some of the other additional look-fors that were added after my analysis. So following the analysis of the 20 books that I was able to find that met my criteria, 3 books really came out as being the top rated in terms of looking at the criteria. So there was the Can and Cancer by Cook from 2013, The Lemonade Club, written by Polacco from 2007, and John's Tricky Journey, written by McCarthy and from 2017. So these are the top rated texts, and just for your relevant reference, the Can and Cancer and the Lemonade Club are both written by established children's authors, and John's Tricky Journey was written by an individual in the medical profession, a nurse practitioner. So in terms of the other part of my study, the second part was after I had isolated these top 3 texts, I wanted to read those texts to children who were undergoing cancer treatment to get their reactions to the text. And so I interviewed 5 children in grades 4 to 6 undergoing active cancer treatment. So my interview approach was qualitative, it was semi-structured, and it was distinctive because it did incorporate the read alouds of the book as part of the process. So how it started, each interview would begin with introductory questions. So for example, do you like reading? What types of books do you like to read? And just for me to establish a rapport with the student, as also to figure out, what were their impressions about picture books in general, as that might help me understand the comments that they might make throughout the story. Then the second part of those interviews was reading aloud the top 3 texts. So I would have the books out. I would ask the children, what order they would like to read the books in. And then we would go through the book reading it. And when I was doing the read alouds, I didn't have specific questions that I was going to ask them during the read aloud. Instead, I had some clarification questions and prompts that were or were not asked, depending on the child's verbal or nonverbal responses to the text. I also, throughout this process, I did provide children with different response mediums, such as drawing materials, recognizing that sometimes they may not want to say out loud what they were thinking, but they might want to draw it. So this combination of methods has been recognized as being very valuable by other researchers, such as Punch, when working with children. So again, the interview started with some introductory questions, then we read aloud the text, and the amount of interviews really depended on the child, their stamina, their ability to, or their interest level and engagement as well. If they wanted to read, more than one book in one sitting, then we would do it. A lot of times we would read one book and then we'd come back for another interview, read the other one, and then a third interview. So that was really dependent on the child, their stamina and their engagement level. And then the final part of the interview was at the very end, after they had read all of the books and we kind of compared the books and talked about them, I asked them to plan their ideal children's book. So if they were writing a book with a main character with cancer, what would that be like? And could they tell me a little bit about those characters, the plot in their own story? So that was the third part. So the fact that I was able to, in this study, combine both the content analysis and looking at children's responses to the text, it's quite distinctive. When you look at the literature examining content analysis of books featuring children with disabilities and illnesses, there's really only one other study that combined that content analysis with reader response, and that was a Said study, which also paired children and also youth with different books that they read and responded to. So again, just the concept of prioritizing children's voice and really hearing what they had to say, given they are the large target audience for children's books, was really important to me. And you'll see as I present the results how those the children's responses really augmented the content analysis. So overall, as I mentioned, I interviewed 5 children. So this is just a brief description of the participants. So I interviewed Zach, who was a Black male in grade 4 with leukemia, Ted, a white male in grade 5 with lymphoma, Sarah, an Asian Eastern European female in grade 5 with leukemia, Mia, a white female in grade 5 with leukemia, and Steve, a white male in grade 6 with a brain tumor. So the type of cancer was not relevant to me in terms of whether that wouldn't have excluded someone from participating in the study. I noticed that most of the children's books did not specifically say what type of cancer the child had, and it wasn't specifically relevant that the children that I was interviewing had a specific type of cancer. So although my sample size was small, I was able to interview children in each of the grades that I have selected. I was able to interview both male and female, as well as to have some diversity in terms of the background of the children that were interviewed. So in terms of findings, there were really two sets of findings that emerged from the study. There were findings related to the evaluation of the children's picture book, and then there were findings related to the lived experiences of children with cancer. So first I'm going to discuss the findings related to the children's picture books, and I've grouped those findings into the following categories. So characterization, plot trends, which ties into the accuracy of representation of the illness experience, language, and then illustrations. So starting first with characterization, I want to talk a little bit about gender. Often in children's books, the trend that we see is that there's more male main characters in children's picture books than there are female main characters. However, in this study, it was the opposite was true, which is consistent with some other studies that have looked specifically at ill characters in picture books, such as Saeed's study, which I mentioned earlier. So what happened in this was there was actually a disproportionate amount of female main characters to male main characters in the picture books, quite a few more female main characters. And this really reinforces that historical connection between illness and the female body and that traditional understanding of females as the weaker gender, which has also been seen. And again, some of these other studies looking at illness in children's books. So also in terms of gender, it was interesting to note that the respondents, the children who participated, the gender of the main character did not factor into whether a book was their favorite or not. It really wasn't a relevance as much as we may have thought. So that was just an interesting thing that did come out of the study as well. So what we found is that a lot of previous content analysis looking at children with disabilities and illnesses have seen those stereotypes of a super crip or a tragic figure. So where the child who is ill is portrayed in those two ways. I did not find that in these more modern books. Those stereotypes were not present. And there was quite a lot of effort to make the characters more multidimensional. So another trend that was seen in the past was that the only thing known about a child with disability or illness was the disability or illness. They were not fleshed out. A lot of these characters were more fleshed out, and the children that read the books did respond to that. For example, in the book, The Canon Cancer, the main character, Eli, he plays sports, he plays video games, and definitely the children who were reading the book could respond to that and enjoyed talking about how they also enjoy video games or they play sports as well. So that allowed them to connect. But what we did find that although there was a multidimensionality, there were a lot of stereotypical, gender roles portrayed. And so, as I mentioned, Eli, the male character in The Canon Cancer, likes sports and video games. A lot of the female characters would like fairies or like dressing up, these more stereotypical gender roles. So there wasn't really any characters who veered out of that, especially when we're thinking about the main characters, the ones who were more developed. They didn't veer out of those stereotypes. The other thing that was noticed that although the characters were more multidimensional, the main characters, they were not very memorable. They lacked a quirkiness or, a sense of humor that those memorable characters that we see in literature have. So they were pretty, this is the character and they like this, which was very stereotypical for their gender. And so they wouldn't really be memorable after reading the book for a while. So that was something that was noticed. Also, by the students when they talked about their own stories and that part of the interview where I asked them to describe their ideal children's book, a lot of them thought about creating a character that was a bit more interesting. So for example, Sarah described her main character of her story as a gingerbread inspired cartoon girl. who would have a wide range of emoji-inspired facial expressions to show everything from disgust, which she would show as her tongue out to the side when she was getting new medication, to joy, which would be like her eyebrows up and her eyes wide when something really exciting happened in her life. For example, when she described her story would be when the girl got to be picked up in a limo. So really that idea of, a memorable character was something that could be improved these texts. So also looking at secondary characters, those stereotypes, those stereotypical gender roles were present there as well. The secondary characters in these stories were more poorly developed, and they also conformed to those stereotypical gender roles. So we were seeing a lot of time the mothers were predominantly showing in those nurturing caregiving roles, and fathers a lot in these texts were absent for a lot of the text. So they were present at the time of diagnosis and then absent until more the end of the story. And children also who were interviewed did notice this absence. And one particular student, Zach, when he was telling his story, he made it a point to emphasize that both parents' active participation in his story, saying things like, mom and dad will be with him when the chemo is coming. So again, that just talks a little bit about the development, so that those secondary characters were not very well developed. And then again, as I mentioned, the main characters did have more multidimensionality, but it was still stereotypical. So one of the other things that was present in the study was that there was very little diversity of race, culture, and family structure. Of the books looked at, there were only 3 texts that showed characters of a race other than white. You can see a picture here of one of the characters who was an Inuit child in John's Tricky Journey. So that was, again, atypical. There was very little diversity in terms of family structure as well. There was only families that were made up of 2 parents, a male and a female, and then, or if there were, or single parent families. So those were the only 2 families shown, and all the single parent families that were shown were only mothers, and there were no other family structures shown. So one thing that was interesting to note was that this story, John's Tricky Journey, did include a lot of cultural information, and that did allow the children to connect to the story more. They did enjoy that they shared that. So for example, in this picture, John, the main character, is eating Arctic char, which is a traditional food in the Inuit culture. And that did promote the children who were reading the book to share some of the cultural foods that they ate, and again, help them to connect to the main character and make some of those text to self connections. So looking at plot next, I'll talk a little bit about some of the trends that I saw in terms of the plot lines in the stories. So one of the one that was very predominant and showed up in 3/4 of the text was this idea of hair loss. So it was the most common plot trend. A lot of the books revolved around the concept of hair loss, and that was the main title. It was factored into the title of the book, as well as was a pivotal plot point throughout. It's interesting to note that hair loss was the only physical symptom of cancer shown in any of the texts. So they didn't show, for example, children having scars or other physical items that we would see caused by a cancer treatment. It was only hair loss. We weren't seeing children throwing up or some of those other side effects that we would see from the treatments. So when hair loss was included as part of the story, it was really, or as a pivotal part of the story, it was really highlighting the emotional toll that had on the child in the story. When it wasn't included as a pivotal part of the story, it was most often used as a visual cue. So it was used in the pictures to signal illness, and then the hair regrowth was symbolizing recovery. So the children that I interviewed really wanted more accuracy in the book, especially in revolving around this, the treatments and the side effects from the treatment that they would receive for cancer. So for example, Steve wanted the pictures in his book to be photographed so that everyone could see him as he is with his scars and all. So another trend that we're seeing in the plot lines was the idea of the happy ending. So the majority of the books ended happily, with the children recovering and returning home and or to school. Children who I interviewed really responded positively to these types of endings and to books that have an overall positive tone. And in the literature, this is also reflected that that children in these times, the benefit of having a book that does show a happy ending can have a direct impact on their emotional well-being. So you could see that children wouldn't have responded very well to a negative ending, as they also, the ones I interviewed, didn't even like when it had a negative, an overall negative tone in the middle. They wanted it to be an overall positive tone to the story. So they disliked it when the books that I read to them focused too much on that emotional impact or the negative aspects of having cancer. So in the one story, The Canon Cancer, that I read to the children, there was a lot of crying. The family, each family member kind of was talking about how it impacted them, and they would often be crying. And the children objected to that and didn't like that it was showing too much of this crying and this really negative emotions that they felt were coming from it. They wanted it to have more of an overall positive tone, and really expressed that along with this, that a lot of the books, and this was something that was I noticed in my own content analysis of the books, was this lack of balance, not showing you know, some of the things that could happen when you're going through cancer that might be considered, of course, going through cancer, it's not positive, but it's not all bad. And that was reflected in the children's comments about what they would have liked to have seen. So in particular, Mia, she said, you know, I wish they would have shown some of the times when the main character was feeling good, because otherwise people think that it's super bad all of the time. And this really gives the reader the wrong impression. So again, she really wanted to see more of this balance. And I did notice throughout the 20 books, it was very much focused on the cancer journey, but not about those things that children might experience, like going to a playroom or connecting with someone in the hospital setting that wasn't shown. So another trend that was seen was inclusion of non-fictional information. So what we were seeing here was describing treatments in child-friendly manner, as well as multimodal ways. This was a staple in a lot of the children's books, and children really responded favorably to this information for its helpfulness. So for example, you can see this picture here is from The Canon Cancer, where the description here is saying cancer is a disease that makes some of the cells in your body turn bad and unhealthy. These bad cells grow so fast, there isn't enough room for the good cells that are healthy. So children were particularly drawn to this part of The Canon Cancer, particularly liking, as Sarah said, that liking the angry faces on the cells, and also like that this picture really explained cancer and not just the treatments. A lot of the children had a better understanding of the treatments than of cancer itself, and they really appreciated this page. And that was a trend, as I said, in a lot of the books that I read for this, was this inclusion of this non-fictional information. And when it was presented in a multimodal way through text and pictures, it was favorably received. So when you look at the books individually, you would say, you know, the plots, you know, made sense, were age appropriate, but really looking at them at a whole, you could see that they were very formulaic. They all kind of started with the child maybe a little bit before the diagnosis, then the diagnosis happening, then a child going through treatment, followed by getting better and either going home or returning to school. This was kind of the format for the books. And what that really did not allow for was, it didn't allow for a lot of those moments of, you know, surprise and delight that we really like from books. You know, a lot of the literature about children's literature, specifically looking at literature like this, which can be used for bibliotherapy, talk about the importance of both informing as well as delighting children. And there really weren't a lot of moments in the books that would, and have that delightful impact on children. Yet when they were included, those were the moments that the children liked the best that I interviewed. So for example, in this book, The Lemonade Club, there was a really exciting point where initially Marilyn, the ill child, first returns to her class, and you can see from the picture here that you can see that they had pictures. So the picture previous to this one shows Marilyn coming into the class, and all of the children are wearing hats, and they're wearing all different kinds of hats. And so from that picture, she's very excited because she sees, oh, everyone's wearing a hat, like I'm wearing a headscarf, and this is, making me feel very comfortable. So the children liked that, but what really shocked them was this next picture, which I've put here on the slide, which was that actually all of the children in the class had shaved their heads. And so when I showed this picture, all of the children just loved it. They were like, wow, pretty amazing. This is incredible. This is my favorite part. And they really were surprised by this happening and really delighted by it. And it was interesting when I asked the students and I said, would you like your class to do that? They said no, they wouldn't want their class to do that, but they appreciated the fact that for the story, it was really interesting and thought it was a big wow moment. So also looking at the content analysis, moving on from plot now onto language, the language of the books in this study were honest. The language was honest, it was positive, it was people first, and it was for the most part age appropriate. So what this is showing is just a move in the right direction. When you're looking at content analysis of books, looking at children with disabilities or illnesses in the past, really, this wasn't something that was seen. There was a lot of not people first language. So it is confirming a positive trend that books are moving towards using the right age appropriate language for children. In terms of the illustrations, also, this also confirmed several research studies that have shown that these modern picture books are improving in the quality of the illustrations for if they're depicting children with disabilities and illnesses. So I did find that the majority of texts exhibited quality illustrations and design that met most of the criteria for effectiveness. So wanted to point out this one because I found this book was quite unique. And as I had mentioned about that moment of surprise and delight in the Lemonade Club, of the class all shaving their heads, I do think that this book here, Jenny and Her Dog Both Fight Cancer, does have the ability to delight children in its illustrations, as it used a felting technique, which is not seen as often in illustrations and was quite remarkable to look at throughout the book. So that was just an example of some of the unique and the varied types of illustrations that were used in the different books. So one of the areas that could be, improved in terms of illustrations was the accuracy. And this was not something that I would have picked up as much in my content analysis until after the interviews with the children, who have really an intimate knowledge of all of the equipment and all of the rules of the hospital and everything. So they really would point out anything that was not accurate. So if there was a picture of an IV and it was not, put in the right place, or it didn't look the way it should look, that was really pointed out. Similarly, situations like in one of the stories, a dog was in John's Tricky Journey, a dog was able to visit the hospital, not a pet therapy dog, but the person's own dog. And they really pointed out, well, that's not accurate, that would not happen. So where they took objected to the illustrations, it was due to accuracy. So the second part of my study second findings that came in the study was really about the children's lived experiences and what reading these books really taught, or I learned, and we could learn by reading books like this to children about how they are experiencing cancer, and also the value of reading these types of books. So I'll start with that. So really it did show, you can think back to your own life. When did you might want to recall, when was the first time, you saw yourself reflected in a children's picture book? And, maybe you didn't when you were younger, and that also reflected or impacted your lived experiences. But I think for these children, when I was reading them the books, it was really, none of them had read a book before that showed a child with cancer. So it was very exciting for them to be able to see a child with cancer going through a lot of the same things as them in the book. And these are some of the comments that they made about why they should read these books. Ted saying, all kids should read these books. Kids should read it who don't have cancer to know what cancer is. Mia stating, I think anyone could read these books, even if they don't know anyone going through cancer, they should just be in any classroom. So not only did they find that this book was really useful for them, but they felt that these books should be included in all libraries, classroom stores, so that other people gain an awareness of what it's like to have cancer. And I thought that was a really important point that they had brought up. So another point that came out of this study was the need for children to tell their stories. So when, as I had mentioned at the last part of the interview process, was when I asked children to plan out their ideal children's picture books. And more often than not, the children wanted to tell me their story. So Steve, for example, he said, well, can I just tell you the real story? I would want the real story in the book. So they really wanted an opportunity to tell their story and to tell, what it was like for them to go through that experience. So this is something that's echoed in quite a few studies. Way back looking at, Myra Bluebone-Langer's, groundbreaking study back in the 1970s, where she learned about the children who are dying, or what children understood about dying by putting herself on a leukemic floor in the 1970s, and really that was something that came out of that, was how much children kind of wanted to talk about their experience, but it was finding kind of the venue. And then it's been, of course, seen in a lot more modern studies to this idea of having opportunities to share their experiences. And I found that was something that came out, and that was really important to the children that I interviewed. So another part that came out of the study was really something that was echoed in the book. So as I mentioned, the books followed a formulaic plot line. It would start with the child, engaged in a regular activity, followed quickly by a diagnosis. And, it was really shifting it. And Swartz writes about how this diagnosis is seen as, a dividing line, a marker of before and after that really ruptures that continuity between the past, the present, and the future for the child. And what I did find was that children's reaction to that moment of diagnosis in the stories really emphasized its life-altering impact. And it was often then that they would want to talk about their own experiences. And for Sarah, when she was talking, this was a pivotal part of her cancer journey. And it was very upsetting to her because, as she shared, she actually wasn't there in the room when the doctors said she had cancer. She was in a different room at the time, and they called her parents back to the emergency room. So she actually wasn't there at that moment when the diagnosis was shared. And that was something that came out as Sarah was talking about writing her ideal children's picture book, because she wanted it to be rewritten that she was in the room when the doctor said that she had cancer. It was very important to her that she was present for that big moment. And as I said, so she rewrote her own story in her book so that she was present at that time. But I think that impact of diagnosis and how it does impact the life and how things are going to go moving forward was really emphasized again through this study. So another part that came out was just how little the children actually knew about their cancer diagnosis. So 3 out of the 5 children were not told or do not remember being told what cancer was, despite living with the illness for between 1 month and 2.5 years. So if you look at this quote here, Steve, who'd been dealing with cancer for 2.5 years, said, "They don't really explain it to me. No one ever really explained it." And Mia, who is 1 month into her cancer treatment, when I asked her to reflect upon whether the description of cancer in that book, The Canon Cancer, which I showed you earlier with the cells, if that was accurate, she responded, "Well, I'm not 100% sure if that's actually what happens, because no one has really explained it." So I think this, this was a surprising result for me, that children didn't have a strong understanding of cancer, especially if they've been dealing with it for such a long time, and really speaks to the fact that we need to maybe look at some other ways to communicate this diagnosis, such as through a children's book, which is a multimodal format that could help children understand it in a different way. So one of the other findings that came out related to children's lived experience was the importance of agency. So children in the books really responded negatively to moments when the main characters in the stories lacked agency. So Steve in particular was really upset by this scene, which you can see to the side here from The Canon Cancer, where the main character, Eli, allows his sister to draw on his bald head. And he really did not like that, stating, "Oh my God, if anyone did that to me, I would not like it." Students equally objected to the scene where Marilyn's experiences, where Marilyn was being bullied at school. They really did not like any time when the child with cancer did not or lacked agency. So they wanted the books to show that children with cancer, although they were going through treatment, they could make choices and they could engage in activities that were unrelated to cancer treatment. So as Mia stated, I would like to show you some of the things, I would like the book to show some of the things you can do. For example, when you're in cancer treatment, you could still do crafts. You could, go to movies or watch them. She was talking about watching movies at the hospital. You could visit with family and friends. You could do schoolwork. These were some of the themes they wanted the books to show. And again, this would speak to that balance, the fact that, those formulaic juries didn't really show some of these other activities that could go on. We were more focusing on what were the treatments, what was going on there, and the medical aspect, but not talking about some of these social and emotional pieces that are important to children when they're going through cancer. So it also revealed some information about living with cancer. So what were some of the themes that were reinforced or enhanced? So one was normalcy. So the students' discussions of wanting to show children engaged in normal activities, having their stories end with them returning home or getting better, emphasize that desire for normalcy. Also was emphasized with this idea of changing perspectives in life. So 4 of the 5 students' experience indicates that it did change the way that they look at life. For example, Mia's illness really led her to focus on the positive by recognizing that, her situation could be worse. And she talked a lot about that in her responses to the book. Some of the things that were expressed that were some new ideas that came out of the study and the way that they responded to the book was a comfort level with diagnosis. A lot of the children did show that they were comfortable with their diagnosis, even if they weren't completely sure of what cancer was. Also this idea of connectivity and an absent theme of isolation. So a lot of previous research studies looking at the lived experiences of children with cancer have seen a trend of isolation as a main theme. The study participants here did not really express feelings of isolation shared by children in these other studies. And that's likely in part due to their atypical living situation. So unlike children interviewed in other studies, the children that I interviewed were surrounded at hospital, school, and at home as they were staying in a healthcare related institution by other families in similar circumstances. So from the study, what kind of recommendations can be given to, first of all, choosing books, or if interested in writing books, or what are the recommendations for moving forward in this area of children's picture books? So first is, to just be aware of language and seek out those languages that do incorporate honest, positive, and people first language. That would be as a first step. Second one would be, try to look for books that do show multidimensional characters and diverse main characters that really reflect that diversity in society in terms of race, culture, family structure, and gender roles. And also looking for characters who do show agency, as that was really an important part expressed by the children in the study. And it's also part of one of the agency is listed on one of the guiding frameworks that I was able to use to help this study. So another aspect is when looking at plot lines, consider, look for books that do maintain an overall positive tone, that are accurate, and do include cultural elements that are accessible to all readers, because that can help children make connection to the stories. When looking at illustrations, again, I'd mentioned earlier the importance of that accuracy that children saw in the illustrations. So looking for illustrations that are accurate, that are descriptive, and that are of high quality. And also, choose books that prioritize entertainment value. Look for books that have those moments of surprise and delight and would really engage a child, beyond just learning about what it's going to be like to go through cancer, which is very valuable for children, but also to engage them and for it to be a really, wanting to find a book that's of interest, especially given that the children were talking about the importance of these books to a general population, so for a child to read it who's not going through cancer, for siblings to read it, wanting to have both that entertainment value as well as that information is shared. So also, because a lot of the people here who would be here at this attendance are working with, or at this conference, attending this conference, are working with children who have illnesses, do you have some recommendations if you are choosing books for specific children that you may be working with that I did find through the study were beneficial? So the first is that, as I mentioned, it wasn't so much as important of the gender of the main character as the whether the child ended up choosing that as their favorite book. It was more the book that best reflected the children's experiences and interests. So if you're trying to select a book about a child with cancer or another illness to read to a child who is going through that illness, it's best to try to find a book that is most mirroring their experiences and their interests at that time. That seemed to make a large impact. Second, finding books that really incorporate a multimodal explanation of medical information is very important and helps to, with children's understanding of the information, which can sometimes be very overwhelming for them if it's just communicated to them by a medical professional, orally. These multimodal explanations, the medium of a children's book can really help them get a better understanding of the medical information. Also found, developing guiding questions and or follow-up activities to encourage text to self, text to text, and text to world connections can really make for a more meaningful experience when reading books to children on this topic. So as I mentioned, part of the study I had was them to design their ideal children's book, and really found that allowed them to talk about the parts in the book that they related to them, that didn't relate to them, and being able to make any changes in their own ideal children's book really helped them to have a more meaningful exploration of the text and how it could impact them positively in their life. And other thing what I would say when reading a book, so if you're, an educator reading a book to a group or also to an individual, really allowing for those tangents. So, sometimes when reading the book, things would get really off topic. The children would get off topic, as we know, as educators, that sometimes happens. But I really found that a lot of those tangents that seemed not relevant, it was really through those talks that really led to some more meaningful interactions and allowed children to express some of the things that they were feeling that only came out because those seemingly off-topic discussions ended up coming back to or relating back to the text in some way. So thinking about future research and some of the limitations of this study, really, cancer does affect the whole family. My study only examined the reactions of children with cancer to these picture books. So it would be beneficial to obtain siblings and parents' responses to the books or to other books that highlight, family cancer experiences. This could reveal information about those books' quality, accuracy, entertainment value, as well as the range of appeal of the text to different audiences besides children who are actually dealing with cancer themselves. Also, my study really looked only at books published exclusively in North America. Countries in such as Europe or countries in Europe and Asia have historically shown a higher comfort level managing difficult knowledge, so things like death and illness in picture books. So as a result, they could be more advanced in their portrayals of children with disabilities or illnesses. So, I think that there's a lot of work to be done to look at a global study of picture books whose main characters have cancer and the benefits of that. I think it also was interesting, as I mentioned, that children in the study knew either little or nothing or very little about cancer, suggesting more research should examine how mediums like picture books could communicate information on the disease itself and how this communication could be improved to ensure maximum understanding. Finally, I think the study really implies a need to prioritize children's voices in childhood cancer research. The children in the study, although in active cancer treatment, were very keen to participate, and their opinions significantly enhanced the content analysis portion of the study and really indicates the benefits of combining content analysis with reader response. So just in closing, wanted to mention that, as this is a passion of mine, I've continued to look at books past the time of my study has ended to see if there's been other texts who've come up and been analyzing them according to the frameworks, the previous frameworks that I looked at, as well as the criteria that I added as part of the study. And I wanted to point out that there was a book published more recently in 2019, When a Kid Like Me Fights Cancer, which also would have been rated very high on the in terms of all of the text, alongside like The Lemonade Club, The Canon Cancer, and John's Tricky Journey. When a Kid Like Me Fights Cancer also has a lot of, fulfills a lot of the framework elements. So if you'd want to check out that book, I would encourage you to do that as well. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention today, and if you'd like to know any more, the research is going to be published in the Journal of Children's Literature in spring 2021 edition. So you can check out for that, look out for that. Also, you can feel free to contact me at my email address there. I'd be happy to speak with you further or to share some more information about some of the books with you. Of course, because we're not in a face-to-face format, I wasn't able to, you wouldn't be able to look through all the books, which would have been great if we were able to be live, but I'd be happy to talk to you further. And I really want to thank you very much for your attention. And these are just some of the references that I used in the presentation, as well as some of the books that this is a list of all of the books that I reviewed as part of this study. So again, thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to the opportunity when we're able to see each other in person, but I do look forward to seeing you at some of the sessions throughout this conference virtually. And thanks very much. And everyone, please stay safe and take care.